Welcome to Horsepower. Today we put the new engine into the Celica. Today we are bolting the new engine with a new gearbox and then installing it into the car. Let's get to it. It's now time to mate the engine to the gearbox. If you've read anything on the internet about Celica GT4s and how to install the gearbox, you'll find a lot of varying opinions, and you'll find a lot of people that suggest the silo method. So this is when you flip the motor up onto its front end, supported in a tyre or something, and then lower the gearbox on with an engine crane, as though you're loading a missile into a silo. I completely disagree with that way of doing it. That looks like a massive pain in the ass. I have a very simple way of doing it that's worked for me for many years, and I'll show you how I do it. So if you missed what I did there, so I kept the engine on the crane, which is quite important. That gives you, and you just take a little bit of weight off it so you can shimmy it round. Put the gearbox on in position, lay the gearbox sort of in position, and then probably the most important part is tilting the back of the gearbox up. So I just put a block underneath the transfer, that angles it up. You can then either push the gearbox on or pull the engine towards you. And then once you're almost home, drop the gearbox down into its normal angle and then send your bolts in. As you can see, that took me about 3 or 4 minutes. Far better than the silo method, in my opinion. The next wee job before the motor goes in the car is the wiring loom. So I could put this on once it's in the car, but it's probably easier to put it on first because it routes underneath the intake manifold. So I'm using my original wiring loom, or when I say original, the one that I used on my last engine setup. And one might think that it won't work because the addition of the variable valve timing. However, I had the forethought, was it 6 years ago now, when we constructed the loom, that I thought I might do this one day, so I added in all the VVT wiring, which basically means it's plug and play now. Obviously where the harness bolts into the intake manifold, it might be a little bit different, so I might need to make some new little brackets or make some small changes, but in essence it will be a plug and play affair. So about 6 years ago, my mate Andrew built this really nice wiring harness for me. It's really is quite a nice thing. I'm not really doing it justice at the moment, but I haven't had a single issue with it in 6 years of racing. So thank you, Andrew, and it will continue to see some more time, hopefully for many more years. So yeah, let's go and put it on. Hopefully it fits. that's the wiring all in. Most of it hides behind the back of the motor. I'll probably cable tie these up at some point. Unfortunately the VVTi wires need extending. They're not quite long enough. I'll need to buy some barrel connectors and some heat shrink, so I'll do that at another point. It's not going to stop me putting it in. The only other plug I need to change was the alternator plug, so changing to this alternator, change from the old school round plug to the later model oval plug. So just a simple chop and repin. Yeah, it all went on there as it should, no real surprises. Unfortunately the injector ones are kind of hard to get to because you can't get your hand down there, but such is life. Alright, let's put this motor in. Before the motor goes in, we have to go back in time. Now that we've got everything out of our engine bay, what I'm going to do is update the intercooler / radiator setup. So this is the lower radiator support. So I'm going to chop that out and then I'm going to lower it about 70mm. If we look down there, we can see that it actually sits quite high compared to the rest of the chassis. So there's no reason that I see that we can't lower it down, and we can get some taller radiators and intercoolers in there. And as we can see, it's actually on the piss. So this radiator support, I made this one because the original was damaged, and when I welded it in there, this side of the car was bent down, and so I made this level, and then it went on the chassis plant and we found that this was down, so we lifted this back up and then found that this is now no longer level. So it's not really a big deal, but it gives me a good opportunity to fix that, get that looking nicer, and then redo the under tray, the bash plate, sort of engine protection kind of thing. With the old one there was a big drop down before it gets to the motor, whereas this one will sit down and then we can basically use a flat plate that goes all the way to the back, so that'll make that easier to make and a bit more sort of nicer as well. It's all chopped out now, I can walk into my car. So I've also chopped up this upper radiator support. It's now like a modern car, so the front all pulls off it, and then you can put the motor in like that and it should be a good time. So now I need to rebuild the structure, so I'm going to start off with this lower support. I made up a couple of these. This is just some 25x50 box section with some 10mm flat bar welded on the bottom and some M10 threads. So these are going to go just here, and I'm going to get migged on there, and then it's going to get another brace on the bottom, it's going to bolt in. Now that we got our down tubes welded on, I'll give the welds a bit of a tidy up later on. I want to do the bottom tube next. So we've got our threads in there. I've machined up 4 of these, so I'm going to wind in bolts. So 2 of them there, 2 of them there,
and then I will cut up another length of 50 by 25 to go in between them. It will then have holes into them, and then we'll weld them in. So these things here are just going to be plugs, but they'll end up as part of the bottom tube.
Credit for this idea must go to Bad Obsession Motorsport. I saw this on one of their early episodes of Project Binky, probably 20 years ago now. The idea is that the lower bash plate will mount to this cross member and needs a very sturdy mounting point. It will become, in essence, a structural member of the car, so it's going to be very nice and strong.
So now that bottom tube has all its nuts in there. Now we're ready to weld it to these bungs. I'm just going to fill this up with a MIG and then take it off and then TIG around here. There's the start of the upper radiator mount. So I drew these up in CAD and plasma cut them out. Another one on the other side. We've got a length of this elliptical tube, which is like a 30 by 15-ish. And so the idea, so that's going to slip into there, like so. And then the same at that end. There we go, that's now in place. I reckon that looks pretty tidy. It's definitely a bit nicer than that old piece of crap that came out of it, which had been dinged and been pretty wrecked over the last 6 or 7 years that I've owned this thing, and rallied it and broken it and fixed it many times. And again, like the bottom piece, this will be removable. A couple of bolts either side, make it really easy to take in and out. So all I'm going to do now is fizz around here with the TIG while it's in place, and then we'll drill a couple more holes in there and there to secure it. And then well, that'll be it for now, but later on we'll obviously get some mounts for radiator and intercooler.
So before I put the new engine in, with the engine looking all very nice and flash, it would be a shame to have an engine bay looking old and crusty as well. So taking everything out, masked everything off, and I'm going to give it a quick paint. I've just given it a quick prime with some etch primer for the bare steel bits, and I'm just going to give it a light dusting over with some 2-pack satin black. I finished painting the engine bay. So there was 2 coats of satin black plus 2 coats of clear. The 2K clear will give it a bit of a shine and sort of give it a bit more toughness. I'm certainly no car painter, so it doesn't look brilliant, but it's a rally car engine bay, so I don't think there's any point in getting too fussy. It'll probably look good once the engine goes in, and then once it does an event it's all going to be dirty anyway. But it will be quite nice to look at until then. So what I'm going to do now is get ready for the engine to go in, and before I do that I need to put back in sort of all the stuff behind the engine, like the steering rack and brake lines and brake boosters, not brake boost. So before I put the engine in I need to put in all the bits that go behind the engine, such as the steering rack, brake master and clutch master, and brake lines and a few little bits and pieces. And then we can start to get into the exciting thing of bolting the engine to the gearbox and then sending the whole unit in. Here is the factory ST185 engine mount. This is the cam belt side, the driver's side, in my case anyway. So it's got a fairly old looking bush in there. It actually doesn't look too bad. But we'll press it out and replace it with one of these. This is a rally spec, or race rally spec, engine mount bush from BRD, Brooks Racing Developments. So thanks to Lou for making those up for me. So that's one for the engine side and one for the transmission side. So let's press this one out and see how it fits in.
The process is then repeated for the gearbox side mount. Now we are finally ready to install the engine.
very happy. The engine is now in. Everything bolted up really nicely. The only minor little thing which I very much expected was getting this mount up and around as we lifted the motor up. It was a little bit fiddly, but really not a big deal at all. It worked as well as really could have been hoped. Having no radiator supports in there made it considerably easier, so I'm already loving that little mod. Yeah, she's looking pretty good. So what I'll do soon is lift it up. There's a few little bolts that I didn't do before, like bolting on the gearbox and stuff, which is just easier from underneath. I haven't been filming this last bit because it's all pretty boring, basic stuff. I've just been bolting everything together. Fuel lines, wiring loom to the engine bay, drive shafts and the exhaust which comes up to here. I can then mate that to the turbo once I install that. The only thing that I've really fabricated was a new mount for the fuel filter. Now I just need to get a new hose end which will go there. Just updated it or refreshed it with some new heater hoses, just normal rubber ones. And just given everything a wee check over and tidy up, and I've relocated the map sensor. It used to sit on the intake manifold on the old setup, and it's not really a great place for it to go because it gets a lot of vibration. So I've mounted it on the firewall there, and then we've got our 3 manifold ports there which all sort of nicely work into the map sensor, fuel pressure regulator and the blow off valve later on. And what I've also done is replace the clutch line with a braided hose. It's way tighter than the old rusty setup, and so that's just a really elegant way of doing it, and I don't need to worry about threading those little 10mm hose end things, which always seems to happen. So now all that sort of basic stuff is done, we can start get into some fabrication. The next stage is to mount up the intercooler and radiator setup, and then once that's done I can start finding a place for the turbo and start doing a turbo manifold.
That concludes this episode. Next time we'll start doing some exciting things like electric power steering columns, intercooler piping, turbo manifolds, all of that fun stuff. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching.